Hey guys, tonight we begin with a subject both deeply theatrical and deeply damp. The one time the god Dionysus, patron of wine revelry performance, and things that get progressively worse, after sunset tried to teach the art of Greek theater to a shipful of pirates. Pirates, I might add, who couldn't tell Sophocles from soup. This particular tale involves one enchanted ship, several barrels of wine that may or may not have had opinions, and a leopard named Euphemia who was frankly better behaved than the crew. Now imagine this: the sea is calm but sulky, slapping softly against the hull of a small merchant vessel whose best days are behind it. The sails sag like tired laundry, the planks creak in protest, and a flock of annoyed seabirds circles above, clearly judging everyone on board. It's the kind of ship that smells like old rope, questionable fish, and mild regret. The crew is precisely the kind of misfit band you'd expect sunburnt, underfed, and always about three thoughts behind their best idea. That evening, the pirates spotted a lone traveler on the rocky coastline of Naxos, a young man with curling hair, a fine purple cloak, and sandals, far too clean for someone who claimed to have walked from nowhere in particular. He carried no weapons, just a bundle wrapped in silk, and an unsettling air of confidence. When asked where he was headed, he simply said, "Out," and gestured at the sea. Naturally, they took him aboard. It was not a decision born from kindness. Pirates are rarely charitable, unless it's charity for themselves. No, they assumed rather quickly, and with much whispering, that this finely dressed stranger must be wealthy, naive, and blissfully unaware that he'd just boarded the most ransom-hungry vessel in the Cyclades. One even licked his lips in anticipation, which frankly tells you more about his social skills than his appetite. They gave him a spot near the bow, far from the main huddle of hammocks and half-stale bread. He accepted without protest, humming a slow tune that made the sails ripple without wind. That should have been the first clue. The second came when the wine barrels, previously empty, began to refill themselves overnight, bubbling softly with a rich, dark vintage that no one remembered packing. And yet there it was, gurgling cheerfully, as though it had just heard a good joke. Pirates in general have three instincts: fight, flee, or drink. They chose the third. The god, because yes, of course it was Dionysus, though none of them recognized him, watched with mild amusement as the crew stumbled about trying to find logical explanations for spontaneous vintage wine. The cook muttered something about blessed weather. The captain insisted it was due to the moon phase. One sailor theorized it was the ghost of a very generous merchant. All of them drank more to investigate. By dawn, another surprise vines had begun creeping up the mast, curling like fingers, around the sails sprouting heavy clusters of grapes that shimmered silver in the morning sun. The helmsman swore one vine whispered his name. The cabin goat refused to go near it and began sleeping upside down. Still, no one put the pieces together. Perhaps it was the drink. Perhaps it was hubris. Or perhaps it was just the pirates by nature don't do nuance. Either way, they remained convinced they had snagged a rich man with soft hands and mysterious wine magic. The ransom, they agreed, would be enormous. One even began sketching a list of purchases: new swords, larger boots, and of all things a set of velvet curtains for the stern. Taste is a slippery concept at sea. But as the days wore on, the ship began to feel less ship-like. At night, the moonlight pooled strangely on the deck, casting long theatrical shadows. The ropes knotted themselves into strange patterns, vaguely resembling masks, some grinning, some weeping. The planks hummed quietly, not like wood groaning from age, but like a chorus warming up before a play. A few crewmen began waking up mid-monologue, unsure whether they'd been sleep-talking or rehearsing. And through it all, the stranger remained pleasant, polite, and utterly unreadable. He spent his morning speaking softly to a bundle under his robe, which, as it turns out, was a leopard named Euphemia. She was spotted, sleepy-eyed, and only mildly carnivorous. The captain, too proud to show fear, pretended this was completely normal. The first mate did not pretend. He fainted. Twice. Historians still argue whether this episode took place in the Ionian Sea or the lesser-known Theater Gulf, named not because of any actual geography, but because the fish there are notoriously dramatic. Some claim the tale is metaphor, a cautionary tale against greed wine or experimental theater. Others believe it's true down to the last vine-covered mast. And if you ask the oldest fishermen on Naxos, they'll swear the dolphins still remember the performance. One apparently still wears eyeliner. Now on the third night, Dionysus finally stood. He clapped once, not loudly but firmly, like a director signaling rehearsal. The ship stopped moving, not slowed, not drifted, stopped. The sea stilled. The sails froze mid-flutter. Even the wind seemed to take a polite pause. Euphemia yawned, stood, and sauntered down the deck, licking her paws and staring directly at the cook, who promptly dropped his ladle and tried to hide behind the onion crate. "Gentlemen," the god said, and others of ambiguous maritime profession, "you've kidnapped me. Or at least you tried." The pirates froze. Several dropped their goblets. One very confused oarsman began apologizing to the mast. But Dionysus continued, "I'm feeling generous. Instead of punishment, I offer opportunity." He turned slowly, gesturing at the moonlit deck. "You will become actors?" Silence. "Then what's an actor?" "That was the captain." Dionysus smiled. "Excellent. We begin at once." And with that the vines bloomed wider, torches lit themselves, and a chorus of unseen voices began humming the overture to a play that had never before been performed. The ship transformed, not into gold, not into flame, but into something far stranger, a floating stage, bobbing quietly in the middle of the sea, under a sky full of curious stars. The pirates, being pirates, did not immediately grasp the gravity of their situation. You'd think turning a ship into a floating amphitheater would raise questions, but no. They merely blinked at the vines now hung like velvet curtains from the yard arms and stared at the torches, flickering with no firewood in sight. One tried to relight them with a flint before another politely pointed out they were already burning. The concept of theater was for this crew as foreign as taxes or dental care. Dionysus stood at the center of the deck, arms outstretched, like a maestro conjuring a storm of drama. His purple robe fluttered, though there was no breeze. Euphemia the leopard stretched languidly beside him, curling her tail with feline superiority clearly used to better stages. "You," the god said, pointing at a lanky pirate with a nose like a fishhook, "shall play the hero." "Which one?" the pirate asked, already sweating. "There is only ever one," Dionysus replied, cryptically. "And you," he gestured toward the cook, who still had an onion peel in his beard, "shall be the chorus." "What's a chorus?" the cook asked. Everything the god said, already walking away. This did not help. Over the next several hours, which in divine terms may have been seconds or decades, Dionysus began assigning roles. One man was cast as a tragic king, despite being mostly illiterate and allergic to tunics. Another, who once claimed to be afraid of long words and long fish, was designated the romantic lead. The cabin goat was cast as a minor prophet. She did not object. Now, pirates are not known for their memorization skills. Their standard vocabulary consists mostly of swears, nautical terms, and the occasional sentimental nickname for rum. So when handed scrolls, actual scrolls fragrant with olive oil and wrapped in what looked suspiciously like theater tickets, they panicked. Several tried eating them. One attempted to barter his script for a sandwich. Still, the transformation of the ship continued. The stern became a stage with trapdoors made from wine barrel lids. The rigging was retied into elaborate backdrops that changed scenes when pulled. A plank was cut into the shape of a tragic mask, nailed to the mast, and promptly fell off. It was nailed again. It fell again. The mask clearly was not in the mood. A soft, enchanted mist began to hover just above the deck, something between fog and stage makeup, giving everything the faded glow of an old memory. The sea lapped against the hull with exaggerated rhythm as though clapping politely. Even the gulls, normally shrieking like unpaid actors, settled into silence. By twilight, rehearsal had begun. The first scene involved a dying prince, a poisoned fig, and a very confusing subplot about stolen sandals. Dionysus watched patiently as the pirates fumbled through their lines, stumbling over syllables and emotion like a goat in a wine cellar. One pirate attempted a dramatic monologue and tripped over a coil of rope. Another forgot his lines entirely and improvised something involving an octopus and a vendetta. It was unexpected. Euphemia watched from her perch atop a crate marked extremely fragile, licking her paws in slow disapproval. One pirate, trying to project his voice, accidentally shouted into the wind so hard that his wig blew off. Yes, they were now wearing wigs, courtesy of Dionysus's theatrical basket of plenty, which had appeared mysteriously next to the tiller. Most of the wigs were curly, and none were waterproof. Historians still argue about this basket. Some claim it was a sacred relic, said to hold the props of every play never performed. Others insist it was just a bottomless hamper of Dionysian whimsy. One late-stage scholar argued it was merely symbolic. He was later silenced by an unexpected delivery of grapevines to his office. By evening, the pirates had descended into open rebellion, not against Dionysus. No, they'd already figured out that upsetting him led to vines in their hammocks and goats who whispered dreams, but against the concept of theater itself. Why are we talking instead of stabbing one? Asked. Where's the looting? Asked another. I miss yelling, whimpered a third, who had been cast as gentle peasant number 4 and hadn't had a line in 2 scenes. Dionysus, with the weariness of someone who had tried to explain metaphor to a rock, called for a break. The ship stilled once more. The scrolls dissolved into grape leaves. The mist deepened. Wine flowed again, though now, from tiny springs that had appeared between the planks. A few pirates wept. One applauded, though he wasn't sure why. Actors Dionysus began addressing the crew from atop an overturned barrel like a prophet delivering a particularly confusing sermon. Are not born, they are fermented. There was silence. Like wine, he added helpfully. Oh, said the cook, I get that. He did not. One pirate, newly invested in the art of stagecraft, raised a hand. What's our motivation? Dionysus smiled. To avoid divine punishment. Fair, said the captain, who was now wearing a laurel wreath and had started speaking in iambic pentameter, entirely by accident. Later that night, as the ship drifted under a too close moon, the first mate was overheard muttering, I swear, the planks are echoing my feelings, which frankly was concerning. The rehearsal resumed. The pirates, now slightly more intoxicated and slightly more theatrical, began embracing their roles. The romantic lead attempted a smoldering look and accidentally sneezed into his own toga. The chorus began harmonizing with the creaking of the ship. Even the goat, in a moment of divine timing, bleated during a dramatic pause, prompting one sailor to proclaim, "She's got range." Dionysus nodded. Better. It was at best a floating disaster wrapped in poetry and wine fumes. But the pirates, poor misguided creatures, began to believe, not in the gods, they already feared them, but in the strange surging power of pretending. Pretending to love, to grieve, to rage, to forgive, to speak in verses to wear someone else's name for a while. It was clumsy, chaotic, and often embarrassing, but it was also something new. And sometimes when the ship creaked just right and the waves hushed to listen, the sea seemed to lean in, curious. The third day dawned with an unsettling quiet, the kind of quiet that suggests the universe is either holding its breath or laughing behind its hand. The sky was too blue, the sea too still. Even the birds, usually delighted to scream at passing ships, had disappeared, perhaps out of embarrassment. The pirates woke slowly like actors, recovering from an opening night that went both better and worse than expected. A few lay tangled in togas. One was wearing 2 sandals on the same foot. The cook had fallen asleep in a wine barrel and emerged not noticeably wetter, but somehow more philosophical. He claimed to have seen the future. It smelled like figs. Dionysus, ever radiant and infuriatingly well-rested, stood at the bow, sipping something purple from a gold goblet. He swirled it with the lazy grace of a man who knew the universe bent slightly toward his preferences. Euphemia the leopard was sunbathing beside him, draped across a crate of props and purring like a distant thundercloud. The crate itself was leaking glitter. Today the god announced, "We refine our craft." The pirates groaned. Several attempted to mutiny quietly by hiding under ropes. One proposed pretending to be mute for the remainder of the voyage. Another offered to swab the entire ship if it meant not having to perform a single tragic monologue about olive farming and intergenerational betrayal. None of these suggestions were accepted. Acting said, "Dionysus is truth wearing costume, and you, my fragrant little barnacles, will learn to wear that truth like the finest robe." He clapped once. Immediately the mast began to shed leaves which reformed midair into intricate masks, tragedy comedy, something that looked like mild taxation. The vines curled into new props. A lyre tuned itself and played a single melancholy note that somehow felt like a review, promising concept, poor execution. Today's lesson, emotional depth. The pirates were not prepared. The romantic lead tasked with portraying a grieving husband began with a hiccup and ended in a nosebleed. The chorus, meant to chant in perfect rhythm instead, broke into an impromptu sea shanty that included the phrase "Poseidon's pants" one too many times. Even Euphemia rolled her eyes, but the god was patient, infuriatingly patient. He paced among the cast like a wine-scented wind, adjusting togas, correcting posture, and occasionally pausing to explain the concept of subtext to someone attempting to cry on command by pinching himself. One pirate, a broad-shouldered brute known as Tharn, was cast in the role of the doomed oracle. His job was to utter cryptic lines while staring into the distance. He interpreted this as yelling vague threats at the sea while juggling onions. Dionysus watched him for a moment, then said gently, "Less produce, more prophecy." Tharn nodded. "Right, less onions." "Got it," he continued yelling. Historians still debate whether Tharn's final performance was satire or unintentional genius. Some claim his curse of the cracked garlic was a metaphor for political collapse. Others think he just got lost in the pantry. Meanwhile, the set had begun to evolve. The rigging now dropped curtains on command. The deck creaked musically. The figurehead at the front of the ship, once a mermaid with unfortunate wood rot, was now animate, blinking slowly and offering unsolicited acting advice. More pain, she murmured during a lull in rehearsal. I want to see the pain. She was ignored. At lunch, the ship served itself. Platters rose from trapdoors. Olives rolled politely into bowls. A goblet walked across the deck and poured wine into the captain's open mouth uninvited. He did not resist. Morale was complex. The pirates were exhausted, bruised, and faintly glittery. They had lost all sense of time, space, and dignity. One insisted he now dreamt in iambic pentameter. Another, formerly mute by choice, had begun narrating everything he did, including drinks, water dramatically, and considers retirement with emotional restraint. Dionysus declared this progress. That evening a small incident occurred. During Act 2, Scene 3, the one with the goat, the prophecy, and the forbidden lute, a minor sea god arrived. No invitation, no warning. Just a bubbling at the stern, followed by the emergence of a damp, translucent figure wearing kelp robes and an expression like he'd just stepped in something wet. I heard there was a performance, he said, glancing around. Is there a guest list? Dionysus smiled. All are welcome, as long as they bring snacks or silence. The sea god brought neither but stayed anyway, perching on a barrel and humming tunelessly. His presence threw off the chorus. One member kept glancing nervously at his gills. Another tried to offer him a scroll which dissolved in his hand. The scene, in short, fell apart. Lines were forgotten. The goat wandered off stage. The lute burst into flames. The audience, now including several confused dolphins, began heckling in sonar. One dolphin blew bubbles in the shape of a question mark. Still Dionysus clapped. Art, he said, is chaos, lovingly rehearsed. The pirates weren't sure what that meant, but they nodded anyway. Historians still argue over the identity of the sea god. Some say he was Glaucus, patron of sailors and occasional amateur critic. Others think it was just a particularly confident jellyfish. The truth, as always, is slippery when wet. As night fell, the ship drifted onward under a sky full of judgmental stars. The pirates, now somewhat tamer and considerably more introspective, gathered for a final scene. They wore masks, they held props. They knew vaguely where to stand. One even remembered his cue. And Dionysus. He sipped his wine, leaned against the mast, and whispered, "Tomorrow we begin choreography." There was a long pause. The chorus groaned in unison. By the fourth day, the ship no longer resembled a vessel of piracy. It had become something else, less a floating den of thieves and more a mobile, wine-slicked theater of barely restrained chaos. The sails hung like curtains from an over-ambitious village play. The decks smelled like rosemary-spilled grapes and anxiety. And somewhere near the galley, a confused octopus had taken up residence in the prop trunk and was now refusing to leave without an agent. Dionysus, as ever, appeared delighted. He glided about the ship with the air of a satisfied director watching a slowly unraveling tragedy, wine in hand, a grape between his fingers, and a leopard lounging behind him like an off-duty diva. Euphemia, for her part, had started wearing costume pieces today. It was a golden circlet and a silk sash tied in a way that suggested she was either royalty or extremely tolerant. The pirates were wilting. Their enthusiasm, once tepid and confused, had now matured into outright performance fatigue. Their faces sagged under hastily applied makeup. Their feet ached from sandals with too much character. Several had developed permanent stage fright. while one previously known only as Lefty now insisted on being addressed as Timeos, keeper of sorrows, even during lunch. And then came the monsters. Well, not real monsters. Probably. But illusions conjured by Dionysus to inspire dramatic urgency. They rose from the sea like rejected set pieces from a particularly avant-garde production, a fish-headed maiden carrying a scroll of doom, a kraken made entirely of old oars and seaweed, and something that looked suspiciously like a bureaucratic eel. They danced across the water, snarling in rhythm while Dionysus shouted notes from the quarterdeck. Feel the fear. Project your doom. Stop looking at the kraken's elbow. It's not canon. The pirates screamed, flailed, and at Dionysus's insistence recited lines from a lost Euripides play that no one understood and everyone mispronounced. One pirate threw his mask into the sea in despair. It floated for a moment, then grew fins and swam away. At some point, someone tried to break character. It was the navigator who had always harbored quiet dreams of being ignored. In the middle of a tense confrontation scene wherein his character was meant to denounce the gods and accept the tragic fate of becoming a sea sponge, he simply stopped, dropped his script, and said, "No, just no." The ship shuddered. Vines recoiled. The sky darkened a fraction. Euphemia hissed, and Dionysus appeared beside him without a sound, smile calm, eyes glinting like wine just before it spills. "No," he asked gently. "O sweet cartographer of cowardice, no is not in the script," and the navigator, pale and sweating, quickly changed his answer. "Actually, I meant no," he said, stretching the sound into a theatrical wail while clutching at the sky. Dionysus patted his shoulder. "Better, but remember to weep from the diaphragm. That evening a dolphin came aboard. Not metaphorically. Literally, it flopped onto the deck during Act 2, Scene 5, the infamous trial of the brooding fisherman, and began squeaking with such intensity that the performance stopped. Dionysus turned to it, listened carefully, and nodded. "Ah," he said, turning back to the cast. "The dolphins have notes." There was a collective groan. The dolphin, apparently, the designated union representative, proceeded to air a long list of grievances, unclear narrative arcs, insufficient aquatic representation, excessive grape peels in the water, and one instance of interpretive dance that had offended 3 separate species of reef fish. Dionysus, to his credit, promised to take the feedback into deep consideration. The dolphin was appeased with a bowl of olives and an apology sonnet from the first mate, who was still unsure whether the poem counted as rehearsal or penance. Historians still argue whether dolphins can actually critique theater. Some say their language is too complex to translate. Others claim that dolphin-led drama societies flourished briefly in the Gulf of Corinth before collapsing due to infighting and tuna-related scandal. No one can agree. Meanwhile, the pirates, bless them, continued. They performed a storm scene entirely in mime. They delivered a love monologue while dodging flying fish. One attempted to convey the anguish of betrayal using only his elbows. It was in a word unforgettable, but Dionysus was relentless. He pushed them, demanded more sorrow, more joy, more sweat. He whispered into the sails, and they echoed lines back in strange languages. He breathed into the goblets, and the wine bubbled with half-formed sonnets. He sat at the stern and conducted the ship like an orchestra of chaos. And slowly, painfully, unbelievably, the pirates began to improve. They held their cues. They wept on time. They no longer ran from Euphemia when she took her stage marks. One even managed to die convincingly, though it turned out he'd just fallen asleep. Still, the performance was moving. At sunset, Dionysus declared the end of rehearsal. The ship exhaled. Torches dimmed. Curtains fluttered into stillness. The vines slackened their grip. The octopus left the prop trunk with a satisfied sigh and returned to the sea, presumably to audition elsewhere. The pirates collapsed in a heap of sweat laurels and half-tied sandals. Tomorrow, Dionysus murmured, "We preview for the sea gods." There was a long silence. Then the captain voice, hoarse and mascara-streaked, whispered, "Will there be an intermission?" Dionysus looked up at the sky, then back at them. "No," he said very softly. "Only catharsis." They awoke to music. Not the kind of music you'd expect at sea, not fiddles or flutes or drunken sea shanties shouted in 6 keys at once, but something older, stranger, a melody that rose up from the planks of the ship itself, humming through the ropes and trickling down the mast like dew. It was the sound of an overture warming up, the kind of music that makes you feel like you've forgotten something important and that a goat is watching you, which in this case it was. The goat, still unnamed, still deeply suspicious of this entire production, was perched on the bow, wearing a tiny crown and eyeing everyone like an unpaid stage manager. The ship had transformed again overnight. Where once there had been crates and nets and salt-stained sails, there were now rows of tiered seating crafted from enchanted driftwood and gently glowing coral. The vines, no longer content to hang lazily, had woven themselves into archways and columns, creating a proscenium fit for divine audiences. Shells had arranged themselves into chandeliers. The figurehead wore a tragic mask and whispered soliloquies into the wind. Even the sails had embroidered themselves with dramatic scenes from previous performances. The one depicting the tragic fate of the potato merchant was particularly moving. The pirates stared. Some wept, some prayed. One tried to hide in a wine barrel again. He was discovered when the barrel began humming the overture in harmony. Dionysus appeared floating down from the rigging as if weightless arms open wide. Today, he declared, "We perform." A groan rippled across the crew before an audience asked the cook, "Yes, of gods naturally." "Is there time for breakfast?" Dionysus grinned. "Only if you can cry and chew simultaneously." They dressed in silence. The costume box had grown. It now included robes spun from seafoam sandals carved from driftwood and masks that seemed to change expressions depending on how you looked at them. One pirate reached for a mask of laughter, only to have it scowl. Another chose a mask of sorrow, which immediately burst into confetti. The cook tried to wear a wig and was tackled by the goat. Backstage was chaos. One chorus member forgot his lines and tried to write them on his arm with squid ink. It did not go well. Another couldn't find his prop fish and substituted a ladle. The captain, attempting to embody a tragic monarch, accidentally impaled his sandal with a trident. No one knew where the trident came from. The stage creaked with anticipation, and then from the sea they came, dozens, no hundreds of divine spectators gliding across the water on shells, dolphins, and floating amphorae, sea nymphs with kelp-woven hair, river gods flickering like water in sunlight. A trio of muses sipping from golden cups. Even a few minor deities of coastal bureaucracy paperwork, fluttering like wings, took their seats near the front, murmuring about tide permits. Historians still debate the authenticity of this audience. Some argue the event was purely metaphorical, the mind confronting itself in the mirror of absurdity. Others point to strange carvings found on half-sunken tablets Depictions of pirates, mid-curtsy dolphins holding applause signs, and a very bored eel wearing a monocle. But here on this enchanted ship, it was very real. Dionysus raised his arms. The music stopped. Silence fell like a curtain. Then he whispered, "Places," and somehow, impossibly, they were ready. The opening scene began with the chorus. They stepped forward, masks aglow, and spoke in almost unison. "We are the voices of the sea, the storm, the sorrow, the soup." That last word was a mistake. The cook had forgotten his cue again. Still, the show went on. The tragic hero made his entrance with a flourish, tripped over a grapevine, and delivered his monologue from the floor. The villain entered stage, right lost his wig mid-curse, and improvised a line about the cruelty of fate and baldness. Euphemia padded through a scene she wasn't in, received applause, and exited with a dramatic flick of her tail. They danced, they wept, they sang. At one point, they enacted the fall of a kingdom, using only sardines and interpretive movement. It was horrifying, it was brilliant, and through it all the sea gods watched. Some wept openly, others took notes. A few handed out shell-shaped tokens of approval. One minor deity stood up and shouted, "Now that's what I call hubris," before being shushed by a wave spirit. Dionysus watched from the wings, eyes shining. This wasn't just theater, this was transformation. His pirates, his grubby, illiterate, fish-scented pirates, were becoming something else. Something better. Not saints, not scholars, but actors. Creatures of feeling, of rhythm, of raw, ridiculous beauty. By the final act, the pirates were radiant. Their masks glowed, their voices echoed with divine resonance. The goat hit her cue, perfectly bleeding during the climactic death scene with uncanny timing. The audience held its breath. The last line was spoken. The curtain woven from midnight and sea foam fell, and there was silence. Then slowly the sea gods rose and clapped. Not thunderous applause, not divine explosions, but a steady, reverent clapping, like waves against the shore, like oars in calm water, like something remembered. The pirates stood frozen, unsure whether to bow, cry, or run. Dionysus appeared beside them. He bowed. They followed. The ship shimmered. The vines loosened. The masks relaxed. The stage dissolved into salt and song. And in that strange, solemn moment, something shifted. They were no longer pirates. They were performers, at least for now. By the time the curtain of sea foam had fully dissolved and the last echo of applause had faded into the mist, the pirates were no longer quite sure who they were, which frankly is a disconcerting thing to realize while standing in a toga on a ship that smells faintly of theater grease, citrus peel, and mild existential crisis. The gods had departed as quietly as they had come. One by one, their thrones of coral and shell dissolved back into the sea. The dolphins, ever the dramatic critics, flipped twice and vanished beneath the surface, leaving only a trail of bubbles shaped suspiciously like question marks. One wave god left a review scrawled on a fish needs work, promising enthusiasm. The ship, now in its post-performance days, floated gently under the pale sun. The air was soft and sticky with praise. Somewhere near the prow, a mask bobbed in a bucket, muttering iambic pentameter in its sleep. The ropes had tied themselves into a respectful bow. Even Euphemia was curled up with a laurel wreath between her paws, purring in a tone that suggested mild professional pride. And the pirates, they were wrecked. Not physically, they'd survived far worse storms, bar fights, and that one incident with the cheese, but spiritually, their souls had been through something strange and sticky and gloriously absurd. They had been stared at by gods, applauded by dolphins, asked to interpret rage using only their hips, and now they had to go back to being pirates. Dionysus, of course, had other ideas. "You've shown potential," he said, the next morning, lounging in what used to be the captain's hammock and now appeared to be a reclining chaise fashioned from grapevines and sighs. "But we have far to go." The pirates exchanged looks. "Further than the sea gods?" the cook asked, rubbing his mascara-smudged eyes. "Oh yes," said Dionysus. "Now we rehearse for ourselves." This to a crew used to measuring worth in gold coins and goat cheese was a troubling development. "But we performed," one muttered. "We did the catharsis." "Yes," said the god. "But now you must do it again. But better, with clarity, with passion, with dolphins who actually understand Act 3. He paused, and this time he added, "We introduce choreography." There was silence, then groaning, and finally the unmistakable sound of a man throwing himself dramatically over the side of the ship only to land in a net that had conveniently knotted itself into a trampoline of rejection. Rehearsals resumed, this time with added movement. The pirates had not danced in years, unless one counted the frantic footwork required to avoid jellyfish-spilled stew or tax collectors. But under Dionysus's guidance, they found themselves skipping, twirling, lunging, and occasionally collapsing. The deck echoed with grunts, shouted counts, and the occasional accidental sonnet. "Feel the rhythm," Dionysus called, snapping his fingers as the ship subtly swayed in time. "I feel something," the first mate yelled back, mid-cartwheel. It might be regret the goat was cast as choreographer. No one questioned it. She stomped approvingly when they got it right, and head-butted them gently when they didn't. Her cues were often more effective than the gods. Some suspected she was, in fact, a minor deity in disguise, but no one dared say it out loud. She wore too much eyeliner for mortal comfort. One pirate, a large man known for his affection toward salted meats and complete lack of rhythm, discovered a hidden talent for expressive hand gestures. He choreographed an entire solo about loneliness using only his elbows. The audience, which now included a small contingent of starfish with surprisingly strong opinions, wept openly. Another pirate, attempting a mid-air spin, accidentally launched his sandal into the rigging where it lodged with a noise like thump and a dramatic silence. Dionysus declared it a metaphor. No one argued. And slowly, reluctantly, hilariously, they improved. They moved with meaning. They bled emotion. One sailor, previously mute, except when shouting orders, began narrating his inner turmoil through interpretive stomping. Another insisted on using ribbons to represent the duality of mankind. He was gently encouraged to tone it down. Historians still disagree on whether any of this constituted actual theater. Some call it the birth of physical dramaturgy. Others call it mass hysteria brought on by fermented olives. A controversial fringe theory insists it was all an elaborate prank by the god Apollo, but that scholar later recanted after his sandals tried to strangle him. What we do know is this: the pirates began to take it seriously. They argued about pacing. They debated the emotional arc of a goat character named Oriclesius. One pirate attempted to rewrite his dialogue in rhyme. Another declared the existing script too mainstream and suggested a postmodern reinterpretation with fewer vowels. Dionysus encouraged all of it. He walked among them like a proud director on closing night, sipping from a goblet that refilled itself and offering feedback in the form of cryptic aphorisms and occasional glitter blasts. Euphemia now wore a cape and insisted on a solo. The ship became a stage again, not because it had to, but because it wanted to. The planks hummed in anticipation. The ropes swung gently, marking beats. The sails shimmered with projected backdrops. Wave stars a giant foot, no one knew why. Even the barrels got involved, arranging themselves into tiered seating for an audience that might never arrive. But it didn't matter, because by now the pirates weren't performing for gods or dolphins or bored seaweed spirits. They were performing for themselves. And maybe that's the point of theater or myth or mildly enchanted maritime disasters. Not to impress the heavens, but to hear yourself echo across the water and think, yes, that was ridiculous and real. Dionysus, reclining in moonlight and wine, clapped once. Again he said, and they did. By now the ship was less a vessel and more a floating fever dream with impeccable timing. The days no longer passed in neat sunrises and sunsets. Time under Dionysus's stewardship had acquired a sort of theatrical flair. It swelled during soliloquies, hiccuped during wardrobe changes, and occasionally reversed itself if someone missed their cue. One pirate claimed he relived the same stage fall 3 times in a row. Each time his landing improved, marginally. The sea had stopped questioning anything. It now behaved like a seasoned audience member, respectfully hushed during monologues, gently clapping with the waves during musical numbers, and once audibly sighing when the romantic subplot grew convoluted. Clouds above formed dramatic shapes on cue stormy hearts. Ominous masks, a goat winking suggestively. It was in every way a proper production, and yet the pirates were restless. "Oh, now you care about plot structure," muttered the chorus leader as he rewrote the 3rd act for the 4th time. "Last week you couldn't remember how to cry on command." They had grown temperamental, opinionated, strangely articulate. One pirate who used to grunt instead of speak now demanded his character arc have emotional symmetry. Another refused to perform unless there was a backstory for his toga. The cook, newly self-declared culinary thespian, insisted that all soup henceforth be symbolic. "This stew represents our shared longing," he intoned, dropping a single olive in for emphasis. Dionysus watched it all with quiet glee. He never corrected them, not really. He'd lean in, whisper something like, "Make the tragedy hum and vanish again." Or he'd tie a vine around a bucket and declare it a metaphor. Whatever direction he gave the pirates, followed it like divine scripture, even when it involved miming wind or interpreting grief as synchronized stomping. And the goat, she had been promoted. Now officially titled Assistant Director of Bleats and Blocking, she wore a sash and carried a clipboard she couldn't possibly read. Still, no one dared question her. She had a gift for timing and a mean headbutt. One afternoon, if it was afternoon, the sun had started spinning in place. The ship encountered another vessel, a fishing boat, small weathered crude by 2 elderly sailors and one deeply confused heron. They waved cheerfully, hoping to trade smoked mullet for fresh rope. The pirates froze. Half of them were in costume. One wore nothing but a toga made entirely of leaves. The chorus had just finished warming up with a chant about betrayal and sea cucumbers. Euphemia was practicing her entrance roar. And Dionysus, he was mid-wine bath, humming a tune only leopards could hear. "Should we pretend to be normal?" asked the first mate, clutching his script. "I forget what normal is," replied the romantic lead, who now wore eyeliner even while sleeping. "Maybe we perform for them," someone offered. The decision was made democratically, dramatically, and with far too many jazz hands. The pirates performed a condensed version of their latest production, The Grape and the Grudge, a sea tragedy in 3 baffling acts. There were mask changes, prop malfunctions, and a scene where someone accidentally fell overboard and delivered their lines from the water. The heron left halfway through. The old sailors applauded politely, then rowed away, promising never to speak of what they had seen. Not our target demographic, Dionysus said afterward, sipping wine from a seashell, but a useful workshop. Historians baffled by later sailor accounts of a ship where the pirates sang about longing and wore too much gold paint classified the incident under nautical hallucinations. One enterprising scholar attempted to stage a reenactment. It ended in 3 resignations and a seaweed allergy lawsuit. Back aboard the ship, tensions brewed. One pirate insisted on a standing ovation after every rehearsal. Another demanded his own dressing room. He received a bucket with curtains. The goat refused to work Saturdays unless provided with artisanal hay. The chorus began unionizing, though no one could agree on the slogan. Still, the work continued. By now, the pirates had begun creating original material. Monologues about storm-washed regrets. Dialogues between a lost sandal and the ghost of ambition. One stunningly avant-garde piece featuring only shadows and the faint sound of chewing. Dionysus declared it dangerously profound, but not everyone was thrilled. Late one evening, during a rehearsal of a scene involving emotional knots and literal rope knots, one pirate stood up, mask askew, cheeks flushed, hair full of prop glitter, and shouted, "Why are we doing this? We're pirates. We rob, we plunder. We don't weep on cue." The ship fell still. All eyes turned to Dionysus. He stood slowly, his expression unreadable. "Is that what you believe?" he asked, voice low. "Yes," the pirate said. "This isn't who we are." Dionysus walked forward. His goblet miraculously did not spill. He placed a hand on the pirate's shoulder. "Then who are you, when you're not pretending silence?" "Then I don't know." "Exactly," said the god, turning away. "That's why we rehearse." And just like that, the rebellion fizzled. The pirate sat down. The script was picked back up. The sea breathed a little deeper. Historians still debate the authenticity of this confrontation. Some claim it never happened, that it's a later embellishment meant to elevate the tale from comedy to allegory. Others swear the phrase, "Who are you?" when you're not pretending, appeared briefly on a piece of driftwood found floating near Crete. Whatever the case, the pirates pressed on. They rehearsed into the wind. They shouted their lines to the stars. They bled glitter and chewed symbolism. They ceased being a crew. They had become a cast. And the sea, always watching, waited for Act 2. Morning came sideways. The sun emerged not in its usual polite arc over the horizon, but as a sudden spotlight, golden, theatrical, and unreasonably judgmental. It lit the deck in a dramatic wash of light that made even the peeling mast look heroic. The ship, no longer a mere sea vessel, now fully resembled a floating performance hall lost somewhere between divine inspiration and community theater. The pirates stirred. They were tangled in costumes and metaphors. One awoke holding a wooden dagger and murmuring, "To stab or not to stab," before realizing he was hugging the ship's goat. She did not appreciate it. Another pirate sat up with a start and demanded to know if Act 3 had been cut. He had been dreaming in third person again. Dionysus, already awake, was reclining in what appeared to be a throne made of planks, ropes, and unwarranted self-confidence. Euphemia the leopard slept across his lap tail, twitching to the rhythm of an invisible drum. The god sipped deeply from his wine, smacked his lips, and said, "Today we discuss character motivation." A low moan rolled across the deck. Not the kind of moan that precedes storm or sea monster, but the despairing sound of a man who's just realized he must once again search for meaning in a scene involving sock puppets and an allegorical sea sponge. The pirates, to their credit, tried to focus. Dionysus floated through them like a benevolent fever dream, whispering things like, "Why does your character fear silence? And the fig is not just a fig, it's betrayal." One pirate wrote these things down in charcoal on the back of his hand. Another tried to tattoo them on his arm using a broken compass. He was gently stopped. Now fully immersed in their new identity as reluctant thespians, the pirates began to squabble, not about loot or rum rations or which cloud looked most like a sea serpent, but about themes. "I think this play is about forgiveness," said one, dramatically applying eyeliner with a fishbone. "No, it's clearly a commentary on fate," said another, clutching a scroll he could not read but had grown emotionally attached to. The cook, who had evolved into a sort of philosophical soup poet, said, "It's about soup." And perhaps it was. This is the point at which historians tend to give up. Scholars studying the so-called floating Dionysian theater period often complain of migraines, interpretive footnotes, and scrolls that smell strongly of goat. One exhausted professor simply wrote "unclear but pungent" and retired to the countryside. Nevertheless, the pirates rehearsed. They revisited old scenes, now layered with new meanings. The confrontation between the masked helmsman and the chorus of regret was reinterpreted as a dance. The tragic death of the octopus queen was rewritten to include 3 more exits and a song. Someone added a puppet. The puppet gained a fan base. Dionysus encouraged everything. He wandered between scenes with a goblet in one hand and a pineapple in the other. No one asked about the pineapple. It was best not to. But beneath the creative haze, something was shifting. The pirates, once purely reactive beings, men who lived for wind and coin, and the odd bout of justified arson, had begun to reflect. Not deeply, not always willingly, but enough. They started speaking in metaphors, even when not on stage. One declared his feelings were adrift in a sea of fog, which made little sense in context, but was applauded anyway. Another began keeping a dream journal. He couldn't write, so he drew stick figures. The dreams mostly involved whales. The ship responded in kind. The wood creaked in rhythm with rehearsals. The sails projected shadow plays when no one was looking. The waves beneath them shimmered with faint outlines of old scenes, as if the ocean itself was taking notes. It was around this time the barnacles spoke, or rather one of the barnacles. During a lull in rehearsal, a pirate leaned against the side of the ship and distinctly heard a raspy voice say, "Less shouting, more subtlety." He froze. "Who said that? Silence?" He leaned again. "You lacked nuance," the barnacle added. Word spread quickly. The barnacles were critics. No one knew whether they had always been sentient or had been transformed by proximity to Dionysus and too much soliloquizing. Either way, they now offered unsolicited feedback. One barnacle suggested more irony. Another requested a different lighting scheme. The pirates listened, somewhat. This development further split scholarly opinion. While some claim this is an allegory for self-doubt, others insist the barnacles were actual demigods, cursed with tiny shells and theatrical snobbery. Back on deck, the show continued. The pirates debuted a new scene titled "The Sailor's Solace," in which a lone man lost at sea finds companionship in a bottle, a memory, and a philosophical jellyfish. It was poorly received by the dolphins, but earned a standing ovation from a passing sea cucumber who may have just been startled. They attempted a tragedy set entirely during a lightning storm, though the lightning had to be mimed due to insurance reasons, and a comedy involving mistaken identities, 2 grapefruits, and an over-enthusiastic rope. Dionysus wept at the latter. No one could tell if it was from laughter or despair. "Keep going," he said, wiping his tears with a prop toga. "You're almost unbearable in the best way." And still the pirates pressed on. They lost track of days. Meals became intermissions. Sleep was a costume change. They forgot their old names. No longer Tharn the harpooner or Bleck the quartermaster, but tragic Shadow, Two, and keeper of the echoing spoon. One night the stars above rearranged themselves into a script outline. The next night they were gone. Dionysus declared it a sign. "What kind of sign?" asked a pirate. "A good one," said the god, and refused to elaborate. By now even the sky was watching, and the sea patient and ancient held its breath. At some point no one could say exactly when the ship stopped sailing in any particular direction. It drifted gently like a memory untethered from maps or purpose. The stars no longer matched any known constellations. The compass spun like it was auditioning for a role. Even the moon developed a habit of lingering a little too long in one place, as if watching the performance unfold below. With mild curiosity, the pirates had stopped caring. They no longer asked where they were headed. They no longer looked for land or loot. Their world had narrowed to the stage, to the script, to the quiet drama of rehearsal schedules and prop malfunctions. The sea had become a backdrop, the wind a cue, the future a curtain yet to rise. Dionysus naturally was thriving. He paced the deck in flowing robes that seemed to change color depending on his mood and the quality of the performance. Today they were a deep burgundy, mysterious, indulgent, with just a hint of menace. Euphemia, the leopard, now wore a necklace made of seashells and grape stems. She was cast as both chorus and storm in the upcoming scene. She'd insisted. It was on this particularly fog-heavy morning that the ship, with a strange sense of timing, drifted directly into a squabble between sea monsters. They had no warning. One moment the deck was peaceful, the pirates mid-rehearsal on a scene titled "The Silence Between Thunderclaps," and the next, a roar broke through the mist like an over-enthusiastic stagehand dropping a bucket. The sea churned. The sails flared dramatically, and two colossal beings erupted from the depths, writhing, shrieking, and flinging kelp with the furious precision of creatures very upset about something and entirely unafraid to escalate. One had scales the size of dinner plates and glowing eyes full of artistic contempt. The other resembled a squid that had gone through an identity crisis and come out as an avant-garde sculpture. They towered over the ship, exchanging insults in some forgotten oceanic dialect that sounded suspiciously like interpretive gargling. "Do we run?" asked one pirate mask askew and clutching a wig. "No," Dionysus said, stepping forward. "We perform." And somehow impossibly, the pirates did exactly that. Right there in the midst of chaos, with waves slapping the hull and monsters bellowing above the pirates, launched into their most daring piece yet, a tempest of regret and other wet feelings. The chorus opened with synchronized stomping, harmonized with the thunder. The lead actor, now fully committed to his role as a drowned poet searching for meaning in sea foam, delivered his lines from atop a barrel that floated toward one of the beasts. The creature paused, listened, and visibly blinked. It was working. Even the squiddier of the two monsters tilted its head during the lament about lost fathers and mislaid anchor chains. One pirate dropped a prop, but turned the fumble into a dance. Another forgot her lines, but made eye contact with the monster and improvised a monologue so raw, so oddly specific, that the entire ship held its breath. The sea monster sniffled. Historians, should they dare address this event, often refer to it as The Battle of the Theater Sea. Not because there was actual fighting, but because two titanic forces rage, and art collided, and for once, art won. Eventually the monsters slunk back into the waves, silently, slowly. One left behind, a single gently weeping tentacle as a parting gesture. The other released a bubble shaped like a standing ovation. The pirates collapsed, drenched, shaking. But alive? Dionysus clapped softly, that he said was truthful. The sea, now oddly calm, exhaled. Later, as the crew toweled off using unused curtains, and the goat resumed chewing through a prop sword, the debate began. Were they moved? Asked one. Were they ever angry to begin with? Asked another. Were we just hallucinating again? The cook asked, stirring a pot of soup that may or may not have been blessed by an emotional jellyfish. Dionysus refused to clarify. He instead launched into a lecture on the history of divine theater critics. You see, he explained, lounging on a barrel of self-replenishing dates, sea monsters were the original reviewers. Before humans, before gods. Even it was the abyss that decided whether a story was worth keeping. The pirates stared. He continued, every tale that has endured once passed through the mouth of something with far too many teeth. That's why good stories have bite. They nodded slowly, as though that explained everything. That night they held a celebratory performance, a special encore for an audience of fog moonlight and a single seagull who landed on the mast and refused to leave. The show was a loosely assembled montage of their favorite moments. The scene where the goat solved the murder, the dramatic slap fight involving two tragic fishermen, and the surprise interpretive dance that ended in someone falling into the orchestra pit, which was really just a rowboat full of sea urchins. They laughed, they cried, they forgot their lines and invented better ones. And for the first time they performed not for gods, not for monsters, not even for each other, but for the sheer joy of telling a story that didn't ask to be explained. The stars blinked approvingly. The sea, exhausted but entertained, rocked the ship gently, and Dionysus' eyes half closed whispered, "Tomorrow." We begin improvisation. There was a collective gasp, and somewhere deep below, a barnacle whispered, "Oh no." Improvisation. To most mortals that word means flexibility, creativity, maybe a bit of fun. To a pirate, particularly one who has spent the last several weeks being transformed into an emotionally fluent, mascara-streaked thespian, it meant terror. Real bone-deep terror. The kind that makes a man consider jumping overboard and befriending a shark out of sheer avoidance. Improvisation. Dionysus explained that morning was the highest form of divine expression. It was what happened when words ran out and the soul stepped forward in its place. It was what theater was born, from what wine was made for, and why leopards should always be allowed on stage. No one argued with that last point. Euphemia had taken to curling up in the orchestra section, glaring at anyone who forgot their blocking. She now wore a feathered hat and had begun muttering lines in her sleep. No one dared critique her performance. The pirates gathered on deck, bleary-eyed and nervous. Dionysus smiled serenely. "No scripts today," he said, tossing an entire scroll into the wind. It exploded into butterflies. "What are we supposed to do?" asked the captain, whose toga had become more philosophical with each passing day. "React," Dionysus replied, sipping from a goblet that hadn't left his hand since the dawn of the grapevine incident. "Respond. Be." This frankly was unhelpful. The first mate raised a tentative hand. "Do we get a prompt?" Dionysus gestured vaguely at the horizon. "The sea is your prompt." They stared. "What part of the sea?" "All of it. The first mate sat down. Improvisation began awkwardly. The pirates shuffled around the deck trying to summon inner narratives from the shifting mist. One began by pretending to be a shipwrecked philosopher who had fallen in love with a jellyfish. Another opened with a dramatic gasp and then forgot why. The cook attempted a two-character scene in which he played both roles, a soup and a man who feared it. The goat played herself, which as always brought down the house. Dionysus clapped at all of it, even when it made no sense, especially when it made no sense. "That's it," he whispered. "Now you're living." Over time, and by time we mean whatever chaotic swirl of sunlight and wine fumes passed for chronology on this ship, the pirates grew bolder. They began to flow together, building scenes out of looks and gestures. One pirate would stomp forward, cloak billowing, and declare, "You stole my destiny." Another would reply, "No, I just borrowed it for the weekend." And suddenly, they were improvising an entire domestic drama set in a lighthouse haunted by regret and seaweed. It was baffling, it was inspired, it was theater. One pirate, a former rigger with a strong jaw and a weak grasp of vowels, created an improvised opera about betrayal and barnacle envy. He sang in a language no one recognized, but everyone felt in their bones. A dolphin cried. The goat nodded solemnly. The sea responded in kind. The waves began to echo certain lines. The fog rolled in dramatically during emotional peaks. A gust of wind, unprompted, blew in a bouquet of lavender and half-eaten props. During a scene about longing, the ship was no longer a stage, it was a co-writer, a co-director, an emotional support ocean. And then during a particularly powerful scene involving silence, shadows, and the delicate art of eyebrow acting, the sky cracked open. Not with rain, not with lightning, with applause. From above, yes, above, descended a slow, shimmering rain of golden confetti. It fell gently, impossibly, in defiance of all weather patterns and narrative logic. Each flake whispered something as it landed, yes or again, or more, of that less juggling. It was divine approval. The pirates stood stunned. One reached out, caught a piece of confetti, and whispered, "Are we good?" Dionysus, grinning like a man who had just tricked time into wearing a costume, said, "You are theater now." That night they celebrated. There was no script, no structure, no plan. They performed for the stars, for each other, for the ghosts of shipwrecks and the dreams of seabirds. One pirate improvised a romantic tragedy with a mop. Another delivered a monologue from inside a barrel explaining the existential loneliness of being round. Someone built a character entirely out of shrugs and became a legend. Euphemia, despite only appearing in 2 scenes, stole the show with a single meow. The goat closed the performance by walking slowly across the stage, eating a scroll and bowing. Even the barnacles clapped. The pirates collapsed afterward, breathless and bewildered. They lay across the deck in tangled togas, their souls warm and exhausted. Some wept, others laughed. One simply muttered again, over and over, until sleep took him. And in that quiet, reverent moment, Dionysus stood at the stern, arms-wide cape, billowing like a second sail. "You've learned," he said, voice like wine poured in candlelight, "not to pretend, but to become." He looked at them, these accidental artists, these ragged, ridiculous humans who had once tried to kidnap him and now wept at sunsets because they reminded them of Act 2 and smiled. "Tomorrow," he said, "we begin rewriting the gods." They did not know what that meant. They would find out soon enough. But for now, the sea rocked them gently. The stars blinked down like old friends. And the ship, this strange, drifting, holy theater, sighed contentedly, ready for its next scene. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles after a miracle, not the triumphant stillness of grand finales, nor the hushed awe of temple rituals. No, this was the sleepy stillness of a troupe who had accidentally found transcendence, and now couldn't remember whose turn it was to sweep the stage. The pirates awoke the next morning like dried-out masks after a flood of feeling. Their togas were tangled, their wigs askew, and several had glitter in places that defied both modesty and physics. The cook, draped in an apron that simply read, "Act 4," or "Bust," muttered vague references to soup-based symbolism while stirring a pot full of olives and dreams. The chorus lay in a heap near the goat who had commandeered the director's chair and was refusing to move without a contract. Dionysus naturally was radiant. He stood at the rail, hair tousled, sipping from a goblet, now visibly exhaling steam shaped like theatrical masks. Euphemia the leopard had perched atop the highest point of the mast-tail, dangling lazily, occasionally batting at clouds that dared to get too close. She had taken to purring during rehearsals, a habit that some claimed summoned applause. Others just thought it was dramatic timing. It was on this fine morning, somewhere between dawn and nonsense, that the captain approached Dionysus with a kind of reverent dread. "We've been becoming," he said, carefully squinting at the wine god, "performing, feeling, improvising." "Yes," said Dionysus, smiling like someone about to say something upsetting. "Are we finished?" Dionysus raised one eyebrow. "Finished," the captain hesitated. "With the show, with the god watching, with becoming actors instead of pirates." There was a silence so profound it made the sea hold its breath. Then Dionysus said, "Finished." My sweet chorus of crust and sweat, this was the warm-up. Several pirates groaned. One lay back down and pulled a mask over his face. Another screamed softly into a prop urn. Dionysus ignored them. He floated, yes, floated across the deck, pausing to adjust a prop tree that had grown real leaves overnight. The ship had begun doing that lately, reacting to story beats. When someone was sad, the figurehead cried seawater. When someone was angry, the sails stiffened like stage curtains in a windstorm. When someone was confused, the deck sprouted fog. It was, depending on your perspective, either magical or deeply exhausting. "The gods are changing," Dionysus announced, placing one glittering sandal onto a crate labeled "Dramatic Bones." "Do not touch." "They watch," he continued. "They murmur. They hunger for stories. And your stories, my foolish, fragrant little barnacles, are sticky." "Sticky?" asked the first mate. "In a good way," Dionysus added, then paused. "Well, in a memorable way." And then he explained. Or at least he tried to. As much as gods ever explain anything directly, the world, he said, was made of stories, not just told by them or shaped by them, but literally composed of them. Time was a script, space was blocking, emotion was the music cue, and what the pirates had done accidentally, sloppily, gloriously, was create a new one, a story that was unscripted, unclaimed, unblessed, and unbearably alive. The gods had noticed. Most were intrigued. A few were offended. One minor deity of orderly scroll-keeping had thrown an entire tantrum that ended in a lightning storm over Crete. But all agreed on one thing: this ragged little troupe of divine abductors turned accidental thespians had done something new. And now the gods wanted more. "Which gods?" someone whispered. "All of them," Dionysus replied, eyes twinkling. "Even the ones who hate theater. Especially them." The pirates froze. They had grown used to being watched, applauded, even transformed. But the idea of performing for the entire pantheon, Zeus, Hera, Artemis, That one god of decorative pottery who always gave terrible reviews was enough to make several pirates rethink their career in interpretive dance. "We're not ready," the captain said. "No one is," Dionysus replied and clapped his hands once. Immediately the ship shifted. Not sailed, shifted. The sky darkened, then brightened again. The air took on a taste like honey and thunder. The waves began to swell not with fury but anticipation, and above the clouds began arranging themselves into something unmistakable. A theater, floating, glimmering, hanging from the heavens by threads of gold and nonsense. It had balconies and trapdoors, columns made of mist, a celestial lighting rig, and at its center an empty stage. "The divine amphitheater," Dionysus said, softly. "We go there tomorrow." A silence fell. It was broken only by the sound of a pirate sobbing into a fake beard. But first the god added, "You need one more rehearsal, something intimate." He turned toward the bow where the sea had gone glassy. "Today," he said, "you perform for yourselves." It was perhaps the cruelest challenge of all. No masks, no audience, no divine giggles, just each pirate alone with a spotlight carved from sunlight and the unbearable truth of their own hearts. The pirates scattered. Some found corners of the ship to rehearse. Others climbed into the rigging and practiced scenes with the clouds. The cook stood in front of a soup pot and delivered a speech so personal, so tragic, that the pot boiled without fire. One pirate wrote a song using only sighs and spoons. Another built a set out of laundry and tears. Even the goat took a moment of reflection, staring into a mirror and chewing slowly as though considering her legacy. That night, they gathered under starlight and did not perform. They revealed. One by one, each pirate stepped forward and offered something real. A fear, a hope, a grief, a dream. The words stumbled, the gestures fumbled, but the truth rang louder than any line ever written. And Dionysus, he wept, quietly, beautifully, and then he smiled. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we ascend." The ship had grown quiet. Not dead quiet, not that eerie hush of something waiting to go wrong, but the kind of quiet that blankets the air after a final dress rehearsal when the set is set. The scripts are scattered, and all that remains is breath and hope. The pirates didn't speak much that morning. They moved like people underwater, slow and reverent, as if their ship were not just a vessel, but a chapel now. Even the goat wore a veil. Euphemia had curled herself into a solemn pose, tail-tucked eyes half-lidded, as if mourning the end of something that hadn't quite died yet but would soon change shape forever. Above them loomed the divine amphitheater. It floated in the heavens like a mirage, made solid an impossible palace of arches and tiers and endless velvet seats glowing with the light of 1,000 suns. The seats were already filled. No one had seen them arrive, but they were there. Gods of storm and hearth and bureaucratic efficiency, nymphs of every pond puddle and poetic metaphor, even abstract forces regret, curiosity, envy, nostalgia, had found seats wearing cloaks made of time. The pirates tried not to look. They didn't want to know which gods might be watching. One swore he saw Apollo polishing a lyre in row 3. Another claimed Athena gave him a slow, deeply disappointed blink. The cook thought he saw a turnip in the audience and decided not to follow that line of thought. Dionysus stood at the helm. He wore no costume, no crown, just a simple robe and a grin that belonged to someone who had spent centuries bending mortals into art. He did not speak, he did not gesture, he simply pointed upward. The ship obeyed. There was no sail, no wind, no effort. The vessel rose slowly, soundlessly, lifting from the sea like a memory, ascending through the layers of dream. The water shimmered beneath them, parting like a curtain. Clouds folded aside, the stars leaned in, and they arrived. The divine amphitheater lowered a platform to meet them, a floating stage of marble and moonlight, suspended by orchestral music and divine whim. It extended like a tongue of fate welcoming them, not as pirates, not even as actors, but as something both lesser and greater mortals with stories. They stepped onto it one by one, no ceremony, no fanfare, just the thump of worn sandals, the creak of fear, and the collective hope that they remembered at least some of their blocking. Welcome, came a voice. It echoed from nowhere and everywhere. It tasted like thunder and honey and very old ink. Show us who you are. The lights, though there were no lamps, dimmed. The first scene began. It was simple. A fisherman and his net. No gods, no battles, just longing. The pirate who played him didn't speak for nearly a full minute. He stood holding an empty net, breathing like the sea. Then he whispered, "Sometimes the ocean gives nothing." There was silence. Then the scene shifted. A chorus of grief, each voice delivering one line. He left before the storm. She never said goodbye. I buried my mother in a shoebox. The lines collided and echoed, merging into something strange and sacred. The gods did not stir. Not yet. Then came the tragicomedy, a scene with Euphemia in the role of a disgraced goddess hiding among mortals. Her entrance, striding in with a wreath of roses and a scroll clamped in her teeth, drew actual laughter from several divine patrons. A river god leaned forward, clearly intrigued. Next, the goat's monologue. She said nothing, of course. She simply stared out into the audience and chewed with exquisite timing. One audience member, a minor spirit of lost messages, burst into tears. But it was the next piece that changed everything. A duet, two pirates, no masks, no props, just voices. They told a story, part truth, part myth, about two men who stole from the same temple, fell in love mid-escape, and were cursed to speak only in song. The melody rose and fell like waves. Their final note hung in the air long after they left the stage, and the gods clapped. Slowly, gently, not as masters appeased, but as beings who remembered for a moment what it meant to ache. The play continued, a dance performed with broken oars, a scene staged entirely in shadow, a reimagining of their first day on the ship performed backward ending, with the leopard purring over the captain's shoulder, and then the final act. It was chaos, deliberately so. The pirates burst onto stage in full costume, laughing, screaming, sobbing, singing. A sea of movement and memory. One mimed rowing a boat through grief. Another climbed an invisible mast made of mistakes. The cook declared his love to a mop. The goat did a backflip. Euphemia bit the scenery literally and dragged it off stage. Then silence. Dionysus stepped forward. He looked up at the divine audience. He raised his goblet, and for once he did not speak in riddles. "These are mine," he said. He turned to the pirates. "You are enough." The lights faded, and the divine amphitheater exploded into applause. It sounded like rain on a roof, like roaring laughter and falling stars and old wounds finally closing. It rang through every tear, echoing down the layers of heaven. The pirates stood blinking, trembling. One whispered, "Is it over?" Dionysus smiled. "No, now you write your own." And with that the platform lowered. Back to the sea, back to the world. But nothing was the same. Descending from the divine amphitheater was like falling out of a dream, made of silk, poetry, and mild confusion. The platform that had so grandly carried them into the heavens now ferried them downward, not in shame or banishment, but in something far stranger, quiet approval. The The gods did not wave. Gods rarely do. But their silence was not dismissal. It was digestion, reflection. As if the performance had unsettled something ancient like a spoon stirring the bottom of a well that hadn't rippled in 1,000 years. The pirates now cast in the unsettling role of post-transcendent mortals, floated in near silence. The sky grew thicker as they descended. The clouds regained their usual muttering. The stars blinked less theatrically, and the sea, ever faithful, opened its arms like an old friend who never asks where you've been, only whether you've come back hungry. The ship waited for them. It had remained unchanged, though it now glowed faintly at the edges. Its sails looked a little more like curtains than they used to. The figurehead, always suspiciously animate now, wore an expression that could only be described as artistically moved. Even the goat seemed slower, softer. She no longer chewed the ropes. She nibbled thoughtfully. No one said a word as they stepped back on board. Dionysus was the last to board. He walked across the gangplank with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had directed the universe and was considering a nap. His leopard followed close behind, dragging a stolen stage prop, a golden lyre, in her mouth. No one dared take it from her. For a long time the crew just stood there. No shouting, no sword checking, no arguments over stew. Then the captain spoke. "We did it?" Dionysus nodded. "But what did we do?" The god smiled, warm and maddening. "You performed truth." The captain frowned. "And what now, That was the question. The pirates were not who they had been. They could no longer return to plundering, not with so many unresolved emotional arcs. One had grown attached to his chorus mask and wore it even in sleep. Another had taken to journaling, in rhyming verse. And the cook had begun labeling his ingredients with tragic backstories. Parsley orphaned at dawn, time too much ambition. They gathered in a circle, something they never would have done in their pre-theatrical lives. And they waited. Dionysus poured wine into a communal goblet, an ancient thing carved from petrified laughter, and passed it around. Each pirate took a sip, not in ritual but in memory. The taste lingered like applause. "We could perform again," one said quietly, to whom asked another. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was open. They didn't need gods anymore. They didn't need divine stages. They had themselves, and the sea, and a ship that now doubled as a theater, with a slightly haunted goat in charge of lighting. And so without plan or audience, they began. The next performance was for no one but the wind, a single scene tragedy, performed at sunset with torn sails as the backdrop and a mop as the lead. It was about regret or loneliness or possibly scurvy. Interpretations varied. Then came a puppet show. 2 pirates reenacted the gods' reactions to their play using broken spoons, seaweed wigs, and highly exaggerated impersonations. Zeus was portrayed as a sulky teenager. Athena had a kazoo. A minor god of fog was represented by someone running around with a damp bedsheet over their head. The cast received a standing ovation from a passing jellyfish. Every night became a stage. They performed between fishing, between repairs, between meals. The ship became alive with art. Ropes moved like actors in slow motion. Barrels doubled as balconies. Even the goat began experimenting with movement pieces, dragging props into formation and staring until the others joined in. They staged a love story between 2 forgotten oars, a courtroom drama featuring only shrugs and eye rolls. An absurdist musical titled Trident Thy Name is Yearning, in which everyone spoke backward and one pirate played a sentient cloud. The cloud was a hit. Historians still debate what happened in this phase. Some refer to it as the floating repertory era. Others call it the lost voyage of dramatic delusion. But those who found fragments, bits of song scripts carved into driftwood, a suspiciously theatrical goat wandering Greek islands, know it was real. Meanwhile, Dionysus mostly watched. He stopped giving direction. He stopped correcting. He simply observed, sipping from his never-empty cup, and smiled. He had planted the seed. The tree was growing on its own. One night during a break between acts of a particularly emotional play about a haunted fish market, the captain found Dionysus at the stern. "I don't think we're pirates anymore," he said. Dionysus chuckled. "You never were." "Not really, that was just your first mask." The captain sat beside him. "Does it ever end?" This becoming the god looked out at the stars. "Only if you insist." That night the sea whispered new lines to the wind. The stars twinkled like stage lights, dimming after a final bow. And the ship caught halfway between myth and memory sailed on. No longer lost, no longer looking, just performing scene by scene into the vast and waiting dark. The plays didn't stop, not when storms rolled in like critical reviews, not when the wind grew sour with the scent of distant politics, not even when a passing merchant ship mistook them for sirens and fled in terror, leaving behind only a half-written trade invoice and a single shoe. The pirates kept performing because to stop now would have been like stopping breath or laughter or the sea itself. Their repertoire expanded daily. There was The Tragedy of the Forgotten Spoon, a heartbreaking monologue delivered entirely in silence by a pirate who had sworn a vow of muteness for character authenticity. The goat directed that one and received 3 accidental bruises and a pineapple for her trouble. Then came Seafoam and Solitude, a series of unrelated scenes loosely tied together by fog machines and emotional sighs. The fog machines weren't real. They just had very dramatic soup that day. By now, each pirate had carved a role into their soul. Not just a stage role, but an identity. The cook was now the alchemist of flavor and loss. The first mate, once a man of hard orders and soft boots, now answered only to the navigator of absence. The chorus had taken on a sort of priesthood, chanting daily meditations over the breakfast stew and occasionally delivering unsolicited existential observations like, "Your face is a metaphor," or "The sea is just the audience pretending to be patient." The ship kept sailing, though, to where no one knew. Maps had long since become irrelevant. The stars above shifted not by constellation but by cue. Orion would raise his arm when it was time to begin. The Pleiades shimmered when the goat was particularly emotive. And the Milky Way developed a tendency to blink during comedic timing like a kindly grandmother who wasn't sure what the joke was but appreciated the effort. One day, a letter arrived. Not delivered by bird or bottle or divine courier. No, this letter swam. It flopped up onto the deck with the desperate elegance of a sentient scroll that had just learned to hold its breath. The pirates gathered around as it unfurled itself, ink shimmering. It was an invitation from a nearby island known to few and pronounced differently every time it was spoken aloud. A small community of artists, dreamers, and at least one ex-nymph turned sculptor had heard tales of the floating theater of the unraveled souls. They asked humbly, nervously, if the pirates would consider performing on land. The ship fell silent. Land. A word that hadn't been relevant in weeks, maybe months. Time, much like the script, had become more of a suggestion than a structure. "Should we go?" the captain asked. The cook stirred thoughtfully. What is land but a flatter stage? The goat blinked once, which meant yes, and so they sailed toward the island. Not quickly, not directly. They rehearsed on the way, refined lines, repainted props, held costume discussions that devolved into debates about the emotional resonance of certain colors. Seaweed green is despair. No despair is more of a dry beige. When the island came into view, they were met not with fanfare, but with curiosity. The villagers stood at the shore holding lanterns and flower garlands and one very confused pelican. They expected pirates, perhaps rudeness, certainly shouting. What they received was a silent chorus stepping onto the sand in single-file robes, flowing masks, glinting in the fading light. Euphemia led the procession, dragging a scroll longer than the dock. The goat brought up the rear, chewing contemplatively on a pineapple rind. The performance was held at twilight, on a stage built from driftwood and possibility. The villagers watched, stunned, as these salty vagabonds of the sea poured out a story so tender, so ridiculous, so beautifully raw, that even the skeptics wept openly, and one old man tried to adopt the leopard out of gratitude. The play The Ship That Forgot. It wasn't a God-featured sea shanty's interpretive mop dancing and a surprise subplot involving a talking anchor who wanted to become a poet. It ended with the captain stepping forward and reciting a line that would later be carved into the town's oldest tree. We are not lost. We are unscripted. They stayed on the island for 3 nights, performed 3 more plays, ate stew with fans, signed autographs on fish, debated the ethics of tragic endings over communal bread. One pirate fell in love. Another gave his costume away and insisted his new identity was villager. 12 dramatically reformed. But the sea called, and so on the 4th morning, without ceremony or goodbyes, the ship was gone. Back to the waves, back to the improvisation of wind and current and divine whim. They sailed on. Other invitations would follow, other performances, some in caves, some underwater, one inside the belly of a very theatrical whale. But that first performance on land, that was the beginning of something even stranger. A reputation, word spread, not of fear, not of conquest, but of emotion, of transformation, of a troupe that left you changed. They were no longer pirates, they were the story. It was somewhere between the whispering cliffs of the Siren's retirement isle and a sea cave shaped like a concerned grandmother that the pirates encountered the storm. Not a regular storm, not rain, thunder, wind, and splash. Those they could handle. They'd handled worse in their pre-theatrical days, with ropes, curses, and a healthy disregard for mortality. But this storm was different. It wasn't loud. It didn't scream or crack. It arrived quietly, like forgotten dialogue creeping back into memory. The sky didn't darken. The sea didn't rise. Instead, everything thickened. The air was heavy with silence. The ship slowed without wind. And the stars, always eager spectators, blinked out one by one like an audience turning their backs. Dionysus didn't look worried. He merely pulled his cloak tighter and said, "Ah, this part." What part, the captain asked, clutching the railing like a lifeline, the part where the story turns inward, and suddenly the ship was gone. Not destroyed, not sunken, just gone. Vanished from the sea, from time, from everything measurable. In its place was a stage, black, endless, floating in void. The pirates stood on it in full costume. No sails, no props, just masks and breath and a dim light that came from nowhere and everywhere. "What is this?" whispered the first mate, who now wore a cloak, stitched with his own nightmares, he insisted it improved the silhouette. The stage of the self, Dionysus said, now standing above them all on an invisible balcony. Every story eventually arrives here. And then without instruction, the performance began. Not one of their usual shows. This was not the enchanted urn of unreasonable grief or two goats and a moral dilemma. This was different. It was memories, not enacted, lived. One by one, the pirates stepped forward and were swallowed by light. Each told their story not with words, but with presence. The cook relived the night his soup burned, and his brother left without tasting it. A silent apology steamed gently above his head. The helmsman re-experienced the moment he first lied about knowing how to steer. The rope burns reappeared on his palms. He bowed to no one. The captain returned to a childhood where he was not yet captain, just a boy who had once climbed a tree to escape his father's disappointment and fallen. In the chorus, they wept for everything, for nothing, for the sheer pressure of being both voice and echo in a world that rarely noticed. It was not acting, it was revelation. They did not wear masks, the masks wore them. Historians who claim to understand this part usually don't. Theologians call it the hollow rehearsal. Poets try to recreate it in verse and fail mostly because rhyming with unquantifiable regret is trickier than it sounds. But those who truly know say this was the climax, not of a play but of becoming. And Dionysus, he watched it all with quiet satisfaction. This, he whispered, is when they become myth. The storm, the inner one passed. The stage faded. The void sighed. And suddenly they were back. The ship rocked gently beneath them. The sails fluttered. The sea was calm. Euphemia yawned from atop a crate, thoroughly unbothered. The goat was meditating, or plotting, or both. The pirates said nothing. They didn't need to. They knew now that their journey wasn't toward something but through. They were not traveling to perform. Performing was the traveling. The journey was the stage, the audience, the role, the rewrite. They'd carried the story inside them all along. The next morning they found a note nailed to the mast. None of them had written it. The handwriting was equal parts prophecy and stew stain. It read, "Wherever you land, they will expect entertainment. Give them truth instead." So they did, on the shores of islands where no one remembered names, in towns built from salt and echo, beneath cliffs where gods once danced and forgot the steps. They told their stories. They improvised scenes from memory and myth. They sang about the weight of waiting. They choreographed storms with their bare feet. One man reenacted the life cycle of a fish entirely through mime. It was upsetting but compelling. Audiences came, not just mortals, spirits, beings, once even a mountain. Each performance changed them. Not the pirates, the audience. Farmers cried, fishermen hugged, children wrote poems. A ghost left behind its chain and danced. The troupe, though tired, never stopped. They didn't need to sleep. They needed applause, not the loud kind, the internal kind, that slow swell of knowing someone saw you, heard you, felt you. And Dionysus, he stayed at the edge, no longer directing, just watching, proud, occasionally weeping into a goblet that now refilled itself with applause instead of wine. He knew what most gods had forgotten, that mortals, when given masks, sometimes tell truer stories than gods ever dared. And this troupe, they had become the truest story he'd ever known. They arrived at a place that did not appear on any map, not because it was hidden or forbidden or even all that far away, but because no one had thought to chart it. It was simply overlooked, a gray little island shrouded in constant fog, where the trees whispered secrets to themselves and the birds flew in anxious circles like they'd forgotten what they were doing. The pirates, now more troop than crew, felt it the moment they dropped anchor. "This place needs a play," the cook whispered, stepping off the gangplank with an armful of hand-painted masks and a pot of monologue soup. They wandered inland. The fog curled around their ankles like an uncertain stage curtain. The trees leaned in. The ground squelched with a sound that seemed to say, "Careful now." They passed half-built homes and wholehearted silences. A few villagers watched them from behind shutters. Faces pale, eyes wide expressions, somewhere between fear and longing. "Has no one performed here before?" the first mate asked. Dionysus shook his head. "Not once." The troop set to work. They cleared a field tangled with doubt and vines, raised a stage from driftwood and courage, draped it in banners made from old sails, and stitched with lines from their favorite scenes. And on the second night, they began. The villagers didn't come at first, only the wind, only the fog slinking closer, only the feeling that something very old was holding its breath. The pirates' performers now in the fullest sense did not falter. They told a story of loss, of laughter, of a god in disguise and a troupe who didn't know they were healing themselves by pretending. The goat delivered her most subtle work to date, chewing a corner of the backdrop during a death scene so gently it brought tears to 3 chorus members. A child came on the third night, alone, shivering, silent. She watched the whole thing without blinking, then left a single flower on the stage. The next night she returned with a parent. By the end of the week, the entire village sat in quiet rows, expressionless, unmoving, as though watching required tremendous effort. But they came. The play that night was different. The troupe could feel it. Something in the ground loosened. The fog watched more intently. The trees leaned in not to whisper, but to listen. They told the story of a town that had forgotten how to feel, where emotion was outlawed and laughter was smuggled like gold, where a group of outsiders arrived not to conquer, but to remind. The villagers didn't clap, they didn't cheer, but they stayed. And when the troop returned to their ship the next morning, they found the fog had parted for the first time in memory. A single villager approached them, elderly with a face like dried parchment and eyes that had seen too little and too much. "Thank you," he said. Then after a pause, what now Dionysus stepped forward, smiled, and said, "You write the next one." The villagers did. Years later, sailors would speak of that island with awe, a place once choked by silence, now full of open-air theaters and small stages in every home. Children spoke in scenes. Elders debated blocking over tea. Emotions were not just permitted, they were expected. And all because a group of pirates stopped being pirates long enough to remember how to pretend honestly. Back at sea, the troupe continued. Their performances shifted. Less theatrical, more lived. A pirate might pause mid-haul and deliver a soliloquy to a curious fish. Another might reenact a childhood memory in the galley while seasoning stew. Even the goat had taken to dramatic entrances, appearing only when the stakes were highest, usually during salad. The ship itself had become legend. Some called it the stage eternal, others the floating folly. One ambitious poet named it the vessel of vulnerable verse, which was not widely adopted but did end up in 3 sonnets and a tattoo. Still the gods watched. From clouds, from waves, from within, the things left unsaid. Some were amused, some were unnerved. A few began sending emissaries, quiet ones, a breeze that knew your name, a wave that clapped at the perfect moment. once a swan who asked quite seriously for a speaking role, and the pirates, they welcomed it all. They no longer feared the divine. They no longer chased meaning. They created it line by line, moment by moment, with each absurd, aching performance. They played to the stars, to the sea, to the silences between. And one night during a lull in the wind and a lullaby whispered by barnacles, they performed for themselves again. No stage, no lights, just the deck, just breath, just each other. They told the story of a man who tried to steal a god and ended up losing his fear instead, of a crew who mistook art for punishment, then found home inside a script, a world too old and too tired, stirred to tears by a tragedy that ended in laughter. The play ended with nothing resolved, just a quiet line, and then they kept going. The sea had grown used to them. It no longer grumbled when their ship passed, no longer tested them with tempest or tide. It simply made way like a stagehand, pulling aside a curtain, letting the floating theater drift where it willed. Whales surfaced quietly, nodding like old critics who'd seen enough to know when something was working. Even the clouds began taking notes, some shaped like questions, others like applause. They didn't dock often anymore, not because they weren't welcome, but because stories now followed them. Islands they'd never visited built stages in anticipation. Fishermen recited soliloquies while casting nets. Sailors sang the chorus to the goat, who refused without knowing where they'd heard it. Somewhere a seaside village declared a national holiday called the Festival of Mildly Confused Pirates, who changed everything. The troupe didn't mind. They performed when moved, sometimes mid-meal, sometimes mid-storm. Once during a surprise tornado of squids, they staged The Tentacled Soul, a piece so emotionally complex that the squids themselves left with scarves and a newfound appreciation for tragedy. But one morning, soft, golden, smelling of citrus and myth, they found something strange floating beside the ship. A boat, empty, no oars, no sail, just a single, exquisitely folded program resting in the seat. The cover bore an emblem they recognized immediately, a golden grapevine wrapped around a mask. Dionysus. The program read, "The Final Rehearsal." No instructions, no destination, just that. They stared. The goat sniffed it once, then curled up beside it with a weary sigh. "What do you think it means?" asked the first mate, voice hushed. The captain rubbed his beard, which now contained a quill, a grape, and a piece of tragic dialogue. That we're nearing the end. The cook stirred something bittersweet, or the beginning. Dionysus, who had been very quiet lately, finally spoke. "I don't know," he said, which was terrifying, because gods don't usually say that. Gods say things like, "It is written," or "so it shall be," or "you spilled wine on my prophecy." But Dionysus, standing barefoot on the deck, looking suddenly very human, said only, "I don't know." And then he smiled. "I think it's time you choose." The pirates blinked. Choose what someone asked, where the story goes next. This caused immediate panic. What if we ruin it? What if it's unfinished? What if we forget our lines? Dionysus spread his arms. Exactly. And so they rehearsed. Not a specific play, not a polished production. They rehearsed possibility. One day they staged The Birth of Silence, where no one spoke, and the set changed shape mid-scene. The next, a comedy of errors involving mistaken barnacle identity, an enchanted sneeze, and a sea sponge with opinions. They rewrote scenes, recast roles. Let the goat direct a full act titled "Chew Gently the Curtain." She received modest reviews from the chorus, but glowing praise from Euphemia, who now wore glasses and insisted on reading scripts aloud in dialect. Each rehearsal ended the same way, with Dionysus saying, "Not quite," and the troupe saying, "Let's try again." Then one night, under a sky so starless it felt like velvet, drawn across the cosmos, the ship stopped, not drifted, not anchored, stopped. In the stillness, they could hear their breath. Then a voice, not Dionysus, not anyone they recognized, rang out across the deck. "Are you ready?" No one answered. Instead, they looked at each other, masks in hand, scripts forgotten, hearts open, and they nodded. The ship tilted forward, not as if descending, but as if bowing. The stars returned one by one, not overhead, but below, reflected in waters that had never before looked so endless. And then the stage rose, not from planks or sails or divine intervention. From them, the troupe became the stage. Their bodies, their stories, their choices shaped the space. There was no script, only breath, only beginning. They performed not for gods or villages or fish, with excellent taste, but for the idea of story itself. They became myth not because someone wrote them down, but because they kept going when the page ran out. Some say they vanished. Others claim they sailed on, performing in fog on moonbeams between dreams. One sailor insists he saw their play in a puddle. Another swears she heard their goat chewing thoughtfully in the wind during a thunderstorm that left her heart strangely light. Dionysus. He faded after the final bow. Not died, not departed, just faded, as all good directors do once the story knows how to tell itself. And the troupe. They are out there still. Not pirates, not performers, something in between. When the wind shifts and you feel a sudden urge to monologue, or you find yourself weeping over a spoon, or you wake up remembering a scene that never happened but changed you anyway, know this: they passed by and left a little of the story behind. By the time the troupe had faded from view, the world had begun to feel their absence like a pause in the middle of a song, soft but persistent, as if something essential had been left humming in the air. Their departure didn't come with trumpets or thunder or a grand curtain fall. It was as most real endings are: quiet, unceremonious, a gentle dimming of stage lights that made everything afterward feel a bit more imagined. And yet they were everywhere, not the pirates themselves perhaps, but echoes, traces, a cadence in someone's speech that didn't belong, a fishing village where the children improvised scenes during chores, delivering lines like, "The sea has denied my proposal again," while hauling nets. A goat seen standing in perfect stillness on a coastal bluff, chewing thoughtfully as if waiting for her cue. Stories spread like spilled wine. Some said the troupe had vanished into the fog, carried off by a divine stagehand's final gesture. Others believed the ship still sailed, visible only to those who had forgotten what they were supposed to become. And a few those with too many scrolls and not enough sleep insisted the pirates had become ideas themselves, drifting like pollen through the minds of artists and fools, planting strange performances wherever they landed. Dionysus, when mentioned, was always just out of sight. There were reports of him in taverns, drinking from cracked goblets and humming half-familiar melodies. A sailor once claimed the god appeared in a mirror wearing a feathered cape and asking if the lighting looked too accusatory. A child in Delphi swore he spoke to her through a grape, then vanished with a bow. The gods were quieter after the troupe. It's not that they stopped meddling. Gods never truly retire, but they did seem more cautious, humbled perhaps by what mortals had done with nothing but masks, wine, and confusion. Artemis supposedly paused a hunt to watch a shadow play performed on cave walls. Poseidon, jealous as always, created a new reef shaped like a tragic mask and denied it was intentional. Even Hermes, patron of thieves and deadlines, was spotted pacing backstage at a mortal play, nervously flipping a coin and muttering something about pacing issues. And the world leaned in. Amphitheaters were restored in forgotten towns. Villages started holding open rehearsals in the public square. People who had never dared speak began to monologue to the wind. It was as if the troupe had lit a match in the underbelly of the human spirit, and now stories glowed in places long thought cold. But it wasn't just theater. A fisherman confessed to the sea. After casting his net, I loved once you know. A baker sang tragic songs to her sourdough, swearing it improved the rise. A midwife began quoting soliloquies mid-delivery, confusing new mothers, but calming anxious gods of fate. Somehow the performance had bled beyond the stage, staining the fabric of life with absurd beauty. One story, perhaps truest of all, concerns a man named Tholos, a former oarsman who had left the ship not long before their final ascent. He hadn't meant to. He'd fallen overboard during a particularly impassioned scene involving sea ghosts and family inheritance, and by the time he surfaced, the troupe had vanished. He returned to land soaked, glittering, and oddly articulate. He opened a school, but not the kind with chalk and punishment. His school had no roof, no walls, no curriculum, just a rock to stand on and an audience willing to listen. People came from far away to learn nothing but how to speak like they meant it. They called it the School of Still Becoming. Lessons were free, but payment was accepted in stories. Tholos never found the troupe again, but he kept a single mask wrapped in seaweed and reverence. He never wore it. He didn't need to. Others searched, of course. Treasure hunters, dreamers, theater critics with something to prove. They scoured the oceans hoping for a sight of the floating stage, the goat, the god. Some found scraps, a wine-stained script floating in a bottle, a scrap of costume clinging to a dolphin. One woman claimed she was visited by the chorus in her sleep, and that they helped her write a one-act play about grief and spoons that brought her estranged family back together. Still, no one found the ship, because it was no longer a ship. It was a question. A question you ask yourself when you pause before speaking. A question you whisper into a storm and hope the waves remember. A question like, if I stepped onto a stage and told the truth, what would I sound like? Back in the realm of the gods? Dionysus stood alone for the first time in centuries. He had removed his crown. His wine was still sweet, but he drank less now. He spoke with softer vowels and longer silences. And every so often, when a mortal play was good enough, when it made the audience cry at something both ridiculous and real, he would stand at the back of the amphitheater, whisper yes, and vanish. Before anyone noticed. He missed them, though he'd never admit it. Missed the cook, who spoke in soup metaphors. Missed the captain, who'd traded command for vulnerability. Missed the chorus that hummed lullabies to the moon. And the goat, of course. He missed the goat most of all. But he understood. Stories like gods do not stay. They move. They stretch. They become. And the troupe had become what every myth longs to be: unnecessary. They were no longer needed to remind mortals of beauty. Mortals had remembered. Somewhere on a lonely island, a child picks up a stick and says, "Let's pretend." Somewhere else, an old man leans out of his window and speaks a line from a play he never performed. His wife laughs, though she doesn't know why. Somewhere the sea carries the sound of a monologue so vulnerable it makes the horizon weep. The troupe left no statues, no temples, No temples could hold them, but they left the stage behind. And now it lives wherever someone says, "What if we try it like this?" They say the last true performance happened on a night when the stars were late. The troupe, if you could still call them that by now, they were closer to myth than mortal had docked near an island that did not show up on maps, charts, or memory. It was a lump of land quiet as a whisper, shaped vaguely like a sleeping ear. The only signs of life were stone steps that led nowhere, and an abandoned amphitheater so old, even the moss had started forgetting it was moss. There was no audience, no gods, no villagers, no wayward dolphins with critiques. Only the wind and the goat, who had grown solemn with age and no longer chewed scenery so much as inspected it. Dionysus stood in the center of the stage. For the first time in ages, he looked unsure. "This is the last one," he said, not as god or director or prankster divine, but as someone who had come to love the sound of uncertainty. The troupe didn't flinch. They nodded, adjusted their masks, stepped into the quiet like stepping into water. No one asked what the play was about. No one asked who was watching. The answer was simply themselves. And so it began. The first scene was stillness. A full minute, maybe longer, of nothing but breath and breeze and the faint creak of a prop box, remembering its purpose. Then a whisper. Not a line, not even a word. Just a breath in a voice that might once have been fear. It spread like fire, in reverse, drawing everyone inward. The cook appeared, next arms full of imaginary stew, delivering a speech about hunger that was clearly about love. The first mate, now gray at the temples, performed a funeral for a starfish. The goat walked across the stage, once stared directly into the sky and left. And then it happened. A star fell. Not a metaphor, not a trick of the torchlight. A real star streaking overhead with all the grace of a line remembered just in time. And from it fell a single figure. She landed with barely a sound. A young woman barefoot carrying nothing but a scroll and a question. She looked at the troupe, at the masks, at the stage, and asked the only thing that mattered, "Can I join?" There was a silence. Dionysus turned to her and smiled with something between exhaustion and reverence. "No," he said, "but you can begin again." And just like that, the troupe stepped back. One by one, they laid down their masks, their cloaks, their roles, not in sadness, not in triumph, just in the quiet knowing of a story that had said what it came to say. The cook handed her a spoon. The chorus hummed a farewell. The goat bowed so deeply even the rocks blushed. And then they were gone. Not vanished, not erased, just done. The girl stood alone. She opened the scroll. It was blank. She stepped forward, cleared her throat, looked up at the sky, and began, "I once knew." A troupe who taught the sea to cry. That was all it took. The stage shimmered, the stars blinked, the island exhaled, and across the world, wherever someone had ever told a story, in fear or fire or foolishness they felt something shift. In a village far away, a boy told a joke he didn't know was poetry. In a storm-battered lighthouse, a widow whispered the truth to a shadow and felt lighter. In a crowded city, a stranger on a train cried during a monologue they didn't know they were delivering. It had spread, not fame, not legend, just the permission to perform, to tell the truth in costume, to wear a mask and find your real face underneath. And so began the age of pretend. Schools were built with stages instead of desks. Courtrooms delivered verdicts through interpretive dance. Sailors spoke only in metaphor during long voyages, and no one corrected them. The town named its mayor the narrator and held annual elections for best supporting ant. The goat became a saint, the leopard a rumor. Dionysus. He walked among them now, older, slower, no longer worshipped but often invited to dinner. He'd nod at a child reciting a soliloquy to a broom tip his cup and say, "I've seen worse." But he never directed again. He didn't have to, because the world finally was righting itself. Not all of it was good. Some stories were clumsy, some painful, some deeply confusing, involving soup betrayal and a chicken named Aristotle. But all of it mattered, because all of it was chosen. And the troupe. They were remembered the way wind is remembered by the way it moves through other things. They became the pause before a line, the tremble before a laugh, the reason someone tries again when no one's watching. No one ever found the ship, but sometimes when the sea is calm and the air smells faintly of theater dust and citrus, a boat appears in the distance, small, empty, carrying nothing but a scroll, blank, waiting, and so we come to the end. But not the kind of end wrapped in curtain calls and floral applause. No, this is the quiet kind, the slow, lingering fade when the last line has been spoken and the air is still full of it, when even the goat has stopped chewing and the props lean against the wall, like they too have emotions now. No one really knows what became of the troupe. Not exactly. They weren't the sort to stay in one place, not even in myth. And if you ask 10 different sailors about their last sighting, you'll get 10 different answers, all equally implausible. They walked into the fog and became moonlight. They turned into birds and flew to a better metaphor. They retired somewhere nice, opened a bakery, and only perform during thunderstorms. The truth is simpler and far more difficult. They stopped needing to perform because the world had learned to perform without them. Not perform in the sense of spectacle, but in the truer, older sense. The kind that turns pain into something shareable. The kind that takes shame and shakes it loose like a wrinkled costume. The kind that says quietly, stubbornly, "I'm still here." Watch this. People began to understand that everyone is in a scene always, sometimes comedic, sometimes tragic, often both. Every glance, every pause, every refusal to speak, blocking. Every argument in a bakery dialogue. Every shared look over soup resonance. And in every town, in every crumbling amphitheater and hastily cleared field, you might find someone doing something ridiculous and sacred, delivering a monologue to the moon, pretending to be a fish with too many secrets, holding someone's hand and pretending not to cry. That's the legacy, not the plays themselves, but the space they left behind. An empty stage in the heart, a blank scroll beside the bed, a mask on the windowsill dusty with waiting. And Dionysus, he appears now and then, old, smiling, a little tired but never done. He might be the stranger in the back row, or the voice that whispers louder when your truth gets caught in your throat, or the breeze that flutters the curtain just as you enter, somehow making you look perfect without trying. He is the god of wine, yes, of theater, of excess and abandon. But more than that, he is the god of transformation through pretending. He knew before the troupe ever stepped aboard that ship that every act of pretending done honestly is a rehearsal for being. And so he waits for the next troupe, for the next fool to step on stage with a shaking voice and a borrowed cloak and a truth too big to keep inside. The stage is ready. The sea is quiet. The scroll is blank. And now we dim the lights. The waves are soft again now. The deck creaks just a little with each breath. The sails, long since heavy with stories, flutter like linen on a line. Overhead, the stars have returned to their places, not to judge, not to guide, just to glow quietly, watching, always watching. You are safe here. There's no audience left. Just the hush after it all. Just you and the gentle rhythm of everything you've heard, folding itself into dreams. The goat has curled up beside the mast. The leopard sleeps beneath the stars. And the ship rocks so slowly now, it might be floating through time itself. You don't need to remember every line. You don't need to be brilliant. You were part of the story. That's enough. So close your eyes if they're not already. Let the wind take your final cue. And drift. Everything's quiet now. You're safe. Let the rest take you.